In this session, we're going to continue thinking about exploring relationships. We're going to look at the concepts of life positions and transactional analysis. The objectives for this session are that at the end of it, you'll be able to explain the 4 life positions, analyse transactions, and assess the value of these 2 models in mentoring. This presentation looks at transactional analysis, first developed by Eric Berne in 1957. Much of the presentation is based on the book by Harris called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Thomas Harris defined these as life positions, and sometimes it may be useful to think of them in that way, as a preference for one's position in a wide range of situations. It's also sometimes useful to think about it in terms of a particular situation. Whichever one, the position we take will influence our beliefs, values, attitudes, frames of mind, and behaviour, and so results. If we start at I'm not okay, you're not okay, this is when things appear hopeless, and this is not a very constructive way for a person to think. This is when the person thinks that they're not all right and the other person is not all right either. As a mentor, you'll want to help them find ways to change their attitude or frame of mind. I'm not okay, you're okay is a position where a person generally thinks of themselves as being not so good as other people. They will probably be making unuseful comparisons between themselves and other people. And this is a situation which can lead to dependency. I'm okay, you're not okay. In this position, a person may well not be very self-aware and will continuously blame others for things that don't go quite right. And finally, we have I'm okay, you're okay. This is where a person has an awareness of their own self as well as a respect and an awareness of others. This exercise is to help you identify the 4 life positions. Think of examples of situations you've come across that illustrate each of the 4 life positions. Added to this, transactional analysis thinks about 3 ego states. There is the ego state, which is about our taught version of life. This version is all about the behaviours, attitudes and precepts that we've copied from our carers and other authority figures. Then there is the adult ego state. This is the thought version of life. This is where we think, where we take in information and process it and store on the basis of our previous experience. It's the state where we are as objective and as detached as we can be. And lastly, there is the child ego state. This is all about our feelings, desires, needs, behavioural patterns that we have without the intervention of our taught or thought versions of life. We can further split the parent and child ego states. In the parent ego state, it can be the critical parent or the nurturing parent. When someone is in critical parent ego state, that is where they establish rules about how things should, must, have to be done. Where they try to restrain the child in other people. It's when someone is acting in a strong, critical, authoritarian, opinionated, prejudiced and moralistic way. On the other hand, there is the nurturing parent ego state. The nurturing parent supports and helps others by reassuring and doing things for them. The nurturing parent is protective, sympathetic, caring, giving and understanding. The child ego state can be split into adapted child and free child. The adapted child is the one that responds to parental requests and admonitions. It's the part of us that is complying, withdrawing, procrastinating, guilty, ashamed, embarrassed and anxious. And then there is the free child. When someone is in the free child ego state, they can be happy and/or disruptive. They are uncensored, spontaneous, affectionate, angry, curious, fun-loving, fearful and hurt. If 2 people are having a conversation, someone may be saying something from one ego state to the other ego state in the other person. And then the reply will come from one ego state of the replier to an ego state in the original speaker. Some of these transactions are complementary and as such that the conversations will carry on quite happily as long as people stay in their current ego state. And then there are some transactions that are crossed. and in these the transactions are likely to be much less successful. Here's an example of a complementary transaction. Person 1 says, "I don't know what the world's coming to." This is from the speaker's parent, in fact critical parent, and aimed to the other person's critical parent ego state. If the other person accepts this and replies from their critical parent to the original speaker's critical parent, then these two could go on for days like this, moaning about things. So this is a complementary transaction. Here is another example of a complementary transaction. Person 1 says, "What are you doing after lunch?" This state is a rational statement inquiring about what the person is doing. So it is adult, appealing to the adult in the other person. If the other person replies in adult to adult by saying something along the lines of, "I'm going to be working on the agenda for the board meeting." Now this conversation could carry on in a similar way for however long people want it to. So it's a complementary transaction. This one is a child-to-child complementary transaction. A complementary transaction can go from one ego state in the talker aimed at another ego state in the receiver. And as long as the other person replies from the ego state in which the message was directed to the ego state the original speaker talked from, then it will be a complementary transaction. An example of this is this one, which is parent to child, and then the reply is child to parent. As long as they both stay in these ego states, this type of conversation will carry on. Where problems arise is where transactions are crossed. For example, in this transaction, the first part is adult aimed at the adult in the other person. But the other person has replied from their child to the parent in the original speaker. You can imagine the result from this conversation. It's not going to be very successful unless someone changes to a complementary ego state. Here is another cross transaction. The first part of the conversation is critical parent to the child in the other person. But their reply is critical parent to the child, and so crossed. Here again you can imagine how unproductive this conversation is going to be unless one of them changes their ego state to a complementary one. Here is another crossed transaction. This is the first part of a two-part exercise to get you used to thinking about transactions. Analyze the following transactions, and are they complementary or crossed? Here's the second part of the exercise. How could you use this model of transactions in mentoring? Here is some answers for the first part of the exercise. The first one was adult to adult complementary. The second one, child to child complementary. The third one, adult to adult and then parent to child crossed. And the fourth one, parent to child to parent complementary.